All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the Global Regulations webinar today. My name is Hannah Clendenin, and I manage our virtual events here at Bandwidth, and I'll be your moderator this morning. I have a few housekeeping items before we begin. All of your lines are muted to prevent any background noise, so all questions will need to be entered into our Q&A box on your control panel. Don't hesitate to ask anything you may want to know, but we'll reserve questions for the end of our session today. You will also receive a recording link to today's webinar via email in the next few days, so be on the lookout for that. We have two speakers with us on the webinar today. We're excited to have Isabel Doe and Mehmet Hussein with us from Bandwidth. Isabel is the Director of Compliance Operations and joined Bandwidth in 2009. She held roles in key account management, business development, and product before taking over compliance in 2020. Her studies in economics, law, and business administration, as well as her firsthand decades-long experience in customer experience, have come together to enable Isabel to bring Bandwidth customers streamlined and consumable compliance services. We also have with us Mehmet, who is the head of Solutions International and joined Bandwidth in 2019 after doing the rounds in UK telecoms circuit. He's then started and currently runs the International Solutions Engineering team, responsible for all pre-sales and technical support while providing strategic guidance for Bandwidth's top-tier clients. Obviously, our presenters have an incredible amount of experience, so if there's anything that I missed that either of you would like to add, please do so. But with that, I will pass it off to Isabel to get us started. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Hannah. So on today's agenda, we want to talk about regulations. Why regulations? Why now? What's in it for you to comply? The real and measurable impact of regulations on your day-to-day. Why compliance across the supply chain matters. And lastly, what you need to act on. And with that, I'll hand over to Mehmet.
So, the complex state of regulations today, it's not an easy environment to navigate. Everybody is dreading it, and nobody really wants to address it full force because it seems quite daunting. We all know the deadlines are coming our way. Let's take a look at some of the ways that ECSs or electronic communication service providers, and you'll get used to that term, how they deal with these regulations. First, they realize that regulations exist in every market. There's no such thing as a regulatorily free environment. They all exist in some way, shape, or form. They hire an army of lawyers or outsource this huge or seemingly huge body of work to some other company to take care of. The finer points of these regulations often seem perplexing and unnecessarily complex. And this all leads to them losing sight of the actual implications of the regulations and potentially how to capitalize on the changes that are going to be brought about by the changing state of how regulations are.
Then we'd like you to ask yourself, what part of compliance do you actually find daunting? Is it the regulations themselves? Or is it the lack of support and or the knowledge around the regulations? Then, how should an electronic communications provider deal with regulations? Well, first, they should know that regulations apply to everybody. Then they should understand that regulations and their impact on you and your end customers and how regulations can help you both. Then you should also prefer a network provider who wants and can help you navigate the regulations, because there are two ways to handle regulations. You can work around it, find a stopgap, maybe, solution temporary. This often leads to a yo-yo coverage, where you lose your coverage one day, gain it through another means, maybe lose it again. Not quite very sustainable, right? Or you can comply with the regulations. This typically leads to more sustainable growth. And regardless of what you might think, both of these are pretty equal in effort, finding a workaround or complying. So you know what we would recommend. But yeah, it's up to you to choose what way you go about this. But then why regulations, and more specifically, why now?
So regulations are evolving for the digital consumer. What does that even mean? a lot of these regulations were written in a time of fixed line TDM communication, where the concept of somebody using a number virtually on a platform which isn't in the country where the number was allocated was just unheard of and slightly impossible. Regulations are changing to keep up with this nomadic method of consuming telecommunications resources, and mainly to reduce the risk profile associated with these resources. Businesses are having to adapt to the methods required to operate internationally. These regulations largely exist to prevent things like fraud. We've seen elements of terrorism, for example, driving an enforcement of regulations which in some cases have existed for a long time but may not have necessarily been enforced as strictly. Another large area of the reason why regulations are coming to bear, robocalling, spam calling. We've already seen in the US the implementation, of stir shaken. We're seeing this action drive other regulations in other countries towards similar conclusions and looking at similar ways of combating a common problem which exists around the world. So, what's in it for you to comply? Why should you worry? Regulations are in your corner. They shouldn't be thought of something which is there to scare you or there to hinder your growth. That's not the intention of this. The intentions of these regulations are to shore up these services. You could liken the telecoms industry or the international telecoms industry to the Wild West. Things have been happening for a long time that have gone largely unchecked, and they're changing. Regulations are going to reduce the amount of yo-yo coverage in the world. So they're going to reduce the amount of countries which fall off the coverage maps for certain carriers and certain providers. They're going to reduce the incomplete call paths of many calls that just don't work because at some point somebody isn't complying with some minute detail of some regulation somewhere. Unifying these regulations is going to help with that. They protect you. They protect your end users. They protect your carriers, your upstream, your downstream providers. They're there for us to be protected and to ensure service longevity. We're also seeing that they're turning a near monopolized industry into something which is much more competitive. A lot of carriers have held somewhat of a monopoly over the telecoms environment, and regulations are forcing them to change. And in many cases, they're forcing them to either do something which is quite onerous because of the size of their customer base, or lose coverage in those areas. So some smaller providers who can be a bit more agile are taking advantage of this. They're complying with these regulations quickly and being best placed to serve customers that are looking for a more compliant service. All of these points lead to a more consistent service with more sustainable growth. But compliance becomes harder if you're not proactive. You can't wait until the regulatory deadline comes upon you. Nobody wants to see that email coming up that says, hey, you've got to do this thing which affects 10,000 customers or 10,000 numbers and you've got 10 days to comply. That's a really difficult position to be in. So proactiveness is going to pay dividends in the long run.
Then we want you to ask yourself this also. How many of you have actually reviewed the regulations with your provider or partners in any of your countries of operations in the last 12 months? So have you reviewed them? You haven't reviewed them. Or 2, you have reviewed them, just not in detail. Or 3, you reviewed them enough and actually taken action. We'd love to hear from you on this as well. So if you want to send us questions on this or answers in the chat, please do. Then let's look at the real and measurable impact of regulations. So case in point, France, that's a deadline coming up quite soon. Suballocation across certain ranges is already not allowed, national, for example, but as of January 2023, suballocation of geo numbers will no longer be allowed as well. So what solutions do you have in place? What solutions does your provider have in place? Will you be able to test these solutions before the deadline? What about the user experience? Will it degrade? Will it be improved? How will you handle your existing services moving forward? Then, also straight after that, in the summer of 2023, the French stir shaken program called the MAN, which is the Mécanisme d'Authentication de Numéros, is coming into play. How are you planning on complying? And how is your provider filtering calls today? You already cannot terminate calls into France over using certain French CLIs over international routes. So that, in combination with the MAN program, will effectively force a reconsideration of your use of international routes. Then also Singapore. Singapore already has certain restrictions around third-party CLI. And also they're going to start following the same format pattern as the France certainly recently did, as well as Finland. So the use of local CLIs over international routes will also be closing. That will come quite soon. That will come before by June, end of June 2022. Then, and this will also be coming to further countries. We suspect more and more of Europe will follow, as well as Asia. Then for the US, also on the 30th of June 2022, the deadline for small voice service providers to fully implement stir shaken will take place. And then we're also seeing more movement from the FCC regarding foreign service providers. So stay tuned for that.
How confident are you about facing these challenges? Ask yourself this question. Do you know what you're going to do? Do you know who you're going to speak to? Are you aware of the questions you're going to ask? Let's talk about that a bit more. Compliance across the communications. Isabel, can we go back one slide, please?
Of course.
Compliance across the communication supply chain matters. I wanted to go back to this slide because this statement is really important. It really matters, and it matters end to end. Ask yourself this question and think where you fit in this, really do. Are you actively participating in regulatory workflows right now with your provider? If you're sitting in bucket number 1, saying no and I don't want to, you should probably think about leaving the international telecom space. It's going to get really, really difficult if you've got no interest in dealing with them. If you're in bucket number 2, which is realistically where most people are, you haven't really started to dig into it, you know they exist, you want to get more involved, this is a good place to be. Open the conversation up with your provider, see what they've got to say about it. If you're sitting in bucket number 3, you're already talking to them, but you're not doing it as much as you want to, this is a really good place to be because it means you've already taken a slightly more proactive position than the rest of the industry. You're having the conversations, you're being exposed to the language that is used, you're aware to some degree of the broad themes that exist across regulations in the world. And if anybody sitting on this call is sitting in bucket number 4 or thinks they are, I'd challenge you and probably suggest that you're probably not. I'm yet to meet anybody that is fully on top of it. I'd be pushed to say that we're totally on top of it. The industry is changing rapidly, and you have to be on top of it and really proactive to know where it's going and what to do.
And further to Mehmet's point here, if you're in bucket number 4, I'd love to hear from you. We would love to just see how you've been handling it and what's been working.
Case study.
Yes. If you're in bucket number 2 or 3, we'd also love to hear from you. We'd love to help. We'd love to try to help you make sense of the regulatory jungle. So we wanted to address a question, a statement that we hear over and over, that regulations are end-to-end, right? So the correct concept really here is that everyone in the regulatory chain needs to be compliant, not just the beginning, which is usually providers such as ourselves, and the end being the end user. The common misconception is that simply just because you're not the one talking to the regulatory authorities, or you're one of the links in between the beginning and the end, that you're not subject to the rules. This is not the reality. And this is what you're seeing with regulators asking resellers, ECS providers to notify all over Europe and more across the world. Every link, every regulatory chain link needs to be compliant, yourself included.
So if you were seeing this on stage, you'd probably be taking your phone out to take a photograph of this slide. If you're watching on a webinar, take a screenshot. It's useful. We're going to run through this checklist of the things that you need to ask and think about when assessing your network partner. How many countries are they national operators in? This is often a telltale sign. If the answer is no, then how can they possibly be aware of what the regulations are? How close are they to the regulatory bodies? How close are they to the source of the information? Every step that they are removed from the direct relationship with the in-country regulators is a step further that information has to travel, and time is used up when these deadlines are approaching. In how many countries are your network partner licensed? In how many countries do they hold this status? Again, this is important. If they're licensed, it means that they have an agreement or some form of communication with the regulators, so they're going to be aware of things that are happening to some degree. If the answer is they're not, they're just reselling, this should be a red flag. And then that's going to lead to this next question. If they say, well, we're not really, we're an aggregator, to what extent? Do they know how many hops it is between them and the in-country provider? Are they aware of this? If they say, well, we are using one or two key providers to access countries around the world, and we think they're directly connected, that's a fairly weak answer. It was strong years ago, but that's not good enough anymore. Can you trace this?
Further to that point, even if they are an aggregator, under the European Electronic Communications Code, as an ECS provider, they should still be notified.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you and them trace the supply chain to the in-country resource? Do they know where these numbers are coming from? Do they know who that last carrier is who's injecting these numbers and receiving them in country and responsible for that direct relationship with the regulator to get these numbers? If they don't, you should be asking more questions. How many steps are there in their supply chain?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mehmet, for interrupting, but just for the tracing of the supply chain, keep in mind that there's quite a lot of suballocation restrictions, secondary, tertiary suballocations. So if they cannot trace it back up, it means that they're quite far down the chain and very possibly not suballocating correctly.
That leads nicely into the next point. How many steps are in that chain? If they're an aggregator, they're going to be part of the chain. You should know that there's no such thing as an unlimited length of suballocation. Many countries are cracking down on the number of times a number can be suballocated or suballocated at all. So you should really be aware of how many steps there are between them and the in-country resource. What's their KYC workflow? What is KYC, somebody might ask? Know your customer. It's not just a term that exists in telecoms. It's something that exists in the technology world in general. It's the name given to the body of work whereby information is collected pertaining to who's actually using the service. And this body of work is being conducted across the technology industry because it's becoming apparent that it's really difficult to track down who's actually using these things, why and for what. Who's culpable if something bad is done? Where does the refund go if something needs to be given back? These kind of questions are what regulators in other industries are asking, and this has bled through to the telecoms industry. Now regulators want to know who's consuming their in-country resource, who's culpable if a nefarious call is made, who do they go to if they notice a load of spam calls coming out of a number that they didn't expect. So it's really important that your network partner has got a robust KYC data collection workflow. How do they deal with LAR? Now, LAR is a is a largely bandwidth term, but it means local address requirements. There are a set of requirements in most countries that list out what data is required to be collected and what kind of information that looks like in varying degrees, sometime down to a specific address location pertaining to a specific commune, for example, in Paris, where you can't have numbers unless you're in that specific location. How are they dealing with that flow? What does that workflow look like? Do they provide you access to emergency services where regulations require it? Know that in Europe, a provider that is providing both inbound and outbound services to the end user is required to enable access to emergency services. It's not good enough to say, oh, well, that's not part of our product set. They need to do it. How are they dealing with it? Are they doing it directly? Are they aggregating? Are they reselling? Is that within regulations or not? What's their process for dealing with the emergency services data submission? If they look at you blankly and go, I'm not sure, that's a big red flag. In all countries in Europe, there is a workflow whereby the network partner is required to obtain and faithfully submit information pertaining to where the police car or ambulance needs to go if somebody's unable to tell them, I'm at this address. This is really important. We've already seen in the US, for example, Carrie's Law and Ray-Barnes Act mandating even further in this area. And we're likely to see this bleed over into the rest of the world, although it hasn't happened yet. So having a very robust emergency services data collection flow already is going to stand them in good stead for the times to come. Do they provide national routes where regulators require it? To get access to emergency services, you have to be terminating nationally. Are they able to provide this? If they're not, that's going to be difficult. As we've already seen in places like France, using a CLI allocated to a certain country and terminating over an international route is going to become a risky business. It's already not possible in some countries, and we expect to see it happen in more. If you were, again, on seeing this live, you'd be getting your phone out, you'd be zooming into the QR code and maybe getting it blurry and not doing it right. But now you've got the time, you're on a webinar, take your phone out, scan this QR code, download our playbook. It's really good. Both myself and Isabel have contributed to it, and many other big brains in the organization. It provides a full checklist to spot the right network provider to use. It's a good guide to show you how to scale in this rapidly changing environment. And it gives you a scalability checklist that you can work to if you decide to trust us, and you should, to grow in this environment that is rapidly changing.
And we'll now move into a time of question and answer, where we'll be taking a few of your questions here. We will not be able to answer all the questions that have poured in during this time, but we will be sure to respond to you in writing if you leave your contact details.
That's great. Thanks so much, Isabel and Mehmet. Like she said, we'll go ahead and move into questions. Feel free to drop those in the Q&A. Again, those are located on your control panel. Isabel, the first question we had, not all of our carriers seem to be impacted by these new changes in regulation. How come some are more impacted than others?
Well, this might be a bit inflammatory, but everyone's impacted. In fact, the regulations apply to everyone. So I cannot speak to other companies here. I cannot speak to their risk profile. I cannot speak to their risk appetite. I can speak to our motto, our guiding principle is that by not complying, by not taking regulations seriously, we would be taking a risk of potentially losing services, of potentially putting our customers' services at jeopardy. And we do not believe that we have that right to play with the services and the businesses of our customers.
If I may add a little bit to that, I've been in a lot of these conversations with a lot of customers. This is a very, very common question. And through discovery, you say, okay, what are they actually doing? Have you often customers will share the communication that they get and saying, is this right? You build a level of trust and you see these things. The general picture, and now this is moving from fact to my opinion based on the conversations that I've been in, a lot of carriers and providers out there have been around for a very long time. They've been very long standing. They've been operating in a market where regulations perhaps haven't been enforced as strictly over the years, and they haven't been penalized. Audits haven't really been conducted. So they're in this comfort zone where they're able to just operate, and they think that, well, it's just another regulation. We've been operating scot-free for so long. It's probably just going to be the same. We're just going to keep the business rolling. Please take it that this is my opinion. Certainly not fact. I wouldn't want to name any names or call anybody out here, but that's more than likely what's happening. We've heard this from many customers. Just because a network provider says, "Oh, I don't think that's true," you shouldn't take it for gospel. You can view these regulations for yourself. They are published. They're on the internet. You can look them up. They do exist.
And we are more than happy to, if you come to us and you ask, okay, you announced this measure, you announced that new restriction, where does this come from? We would be more than happy to share our discovery with you.
That's great. So during the webinar, we gave a few examples of countries. What countries do you foresee next?
For sure, Europe, the rest of Europe, all of Europe. The European Electronic Communications Code stretches across all of the member states, and Switzerland and Norway are also closely collaborating on it. So yes, we expect to see similar notification requirements across the block. We're expecting to see just the harmonization of CLI usage over international and national routes, etc. What we're seeing in some countries so far, we expect to see it more in the coming months and years. And then we also see quite a lot of movement over in Asia.
This is, again, it's a very common question that customers ask once they build the level of trust and then go, okay, you're probably telling the truth about this country. What's coming next? It's simple. There's a list. It's published. And the list is all the countries in Europe. There's a deadline, and the deadline was the end of 2020. That should ring some alarm bells. This should have been done by now. But the way that the EU works is that each country's got their own specific timeline, and they've been given some grace, and we've been through a pandemic, so things are lagging a bit. But the reality is the European Electronic Communications Code was issued. That does mandate a change in regulations, and all countries in Europe are implementing it in their own timeline. You should expect to see this happen in Europe and in the countries around Europe. It's very common that they adopt similar rules and regulations to the countries that their neighbors are in, that are their neighbors, even though they're not technically part of the European Union. We're also seeing this in APAC, in Asia. We're seeing. Sorry for that, Isabel. I'm sure you'll speak next. We're seeing in Asia that they're deciding to adopt these regulations because they're seeing them work. If you see all the countries in Europe adopting a certain standpoint, it stands to reason that you're going to say, well, if I haven't quite fully thought through how my regulations are going to work, it might be safe to just copy another country that's already done it, implemented it, and can see it working.
And if you're interested in knowing more, like having an idea of kind of where things are going, what's coming up next, where things are kind of maybe a little bit hotter at the moment, definitely subscribe to our compliance newsletter. It comes out about quarterly, and we try to give you an idea of what the tendencies are, idea of what the trends are, idea of what's happening right now. Where do you need to pay attention to now? As well as provide you with some resources that we can offer you from time to time. Also, I forgot to mention it earlier, but if you are interested in talking about compliance, so this is just a taster of what the regulatory situation is going to be moving forward. If you want to discuss this further, definitely contact your rep, your account manager, CSM manager, and have them book a call with the compliance team. We'd be more than happy to sit down with you and your compliance team or your regulatory team, just kind of go over your countries with us, maybe even look at countries you're looking at to expand or countries you're looking to minimize risk in. We would be so happy to hear from you. So definitely hit your wrap up.
That's great. And Isabel, you mentioned the newsletter. Where can they subscribe to that?
So if you have a Bandwidth International account, go to the portal and add yourself as a contact, a regulatory contact. If you do that, you will get a copy of all of our regulatory newsletters and all of our also regulatory just compliance comms, etc., so that you don't miss and you're not taken by surprise in any countries.
And if you're not already a Bandwidth customer, that's a really good excuse to become one.
Perfect.
I'm half a salesman. It's a shameless plug.
We'll allow it. So, Mehmet, you mentioned a lot of these regulations began in 2020. Why are we just now hearing about this?
Well, bureaucrats take a long time. They take a long time to get things done. The deadline was the end of 2020. The deadline, and they haven't implemented it yet. The reality is there's going to be an avalanche of these coming forward as time goes on. We're now coming out the back of the pandemic, which caused a lot of slowdowns in a lot of things. Things are getting back to some state of normal, and people are resuming these bodies of work that were urgent and still are. So this is why it's happening right now.
Indeed. And there's that knock-on effect that Mehmet mentioned earlier. The EU bloc is dealing with the regulations as a bloc, but all the neighboring countries around, clearly it's an easy copy-paste, right? The EU already did their homework on this. They've done the planning. Why not? Why not look at it? Why not learn and see what we can adopt ourselves, right? And also, I think we mentioned this earlier, there's this avalanche of spam calls, robocalls, abuse, fraud over the telephony networks. Something had to happen. Something had to be done simply, and that's why we're seeing. That's why, and yes, the world changed. Then regulators also are finally catching up, right? A lot of the telecom regulations are decades old. A lot of it wasn't really fit for purpose for the world of VoIP, for the world of globalization and working from home. So hence we're seeing now as the regulators catching up, the regulators adapting their playbook accordingly.
That's great. Well, as Isabel said, we will not be able to get to all of the questions today, but like she said, reach out to your rep, contact us, and we would love to follow up on any questions that you have. As a reminder, the link for the recording for today's webinar will be available in the next few business days. So again, just be on the lookout for that. And again, if you'd like to chat more one-on-one, Isabel mentioned this a couple of times, but please set a meeting with your rep. They'd love to help you schedule a meeting with the compliance team to chat more, or you can email us at webinars@bandwidth.com, and we'd love to help connect you to the resources that we have here.
Regulations are to.
But with that, thank you, Mehmet and Isabel, for joining us. We hope that this was informative for you all and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.